The person I never noticed. Ayan believed that life was easier when everything had a plan. At 22, he had already decided what the next few years of his life should look like. He would finish university with good grades, find a stable job, help his family, and eventually build a quiet life of his own. There was no room in that plan for unnecessary complications, especially romance. Ayan had watched enough people around him become distracted by relationships, arguments, jealousy, and heartbreak. He didn't want any of that. To him, love seemed unpredictable, and unpredictable things made him uncomfortable. His best friend, Hamza, often teased him about it. "You act like you're 45, Hamza said one afternoon as they walked across the university courtyard. Ayan looked at him. "What's wrong with being responsible?" "Nothing. But you're 22. You should at least know how to enjoy yourself." "I enjoy myself." "You read textbooks on weekends. They're useful." Hamza laughed. "Exactly my point." Ayan shook his head and continued toward the library. That was where he first noticed Zain. Not because Zain was trying to attract attention. Actually, it was the opposite. Zain was standing near the notice board, trying to remove a paper that had been pinned over another announcement. He was dressed casually, carrying a backpack over one shoulder, and arguing with another student about which project group they belonged to. Ayan barely paid attention. He walked past. A few minutes later, his professor announced a new group assignment. Students were divided into pairs. When Ayan heard his name followed by Zain's, he looked across the room. Zain looked equally surprised. After class, Zain approached him. "So, we're partners." Ayan nodded. "Looks like it." Zain smiled. "You seem excited. I wasn't aware I needed to celebrate." Zain laughed. "Okay, I think we're going to get along." Ayan wasn't convinced. Their first meeting was at the university library the next day. Ayan arrived 10 minutes early with notes, references, and a detailed plan. Zain arrived exactly on time, carrying only a notebook. Ayan looked at the notebook. "That's it." Zain sat down. "What else do I need?" "Research." "I did research." "Where?" Zain opened the notebook. "Here." Ayan stared at the nearly empty pages. "You wrote 3 lines. Important 3 lines." Ayan sighed. For the next hour, he explained the project requirements while Zain listened carefully. To Ayan's surprise, Zain began asking intelligent questions. He had ideas that Ayan hadn't considered. By the end of the meeting, Ayan had to admit that Zain wasn't careless. He was simply different. Over the following days, they worked together regularly. Ayan discovered that Zain was surprisingly hardworking. He also discovered that Zain had a habit of turning serious conversations into jokes. Whenever Ayan became stressed, Zain found a way to make him laugh. At first, Ayan found it irritating. Eventually, he started looking forward to it. One evening, they stayed late at the library to finish an important section of their project. Most students had already left. The university corridors were quiet. Zain looked at the clock. "We've been working for 4 hours. We need to finish." "You need food." "I'm Fina." "You've said that 3 times." Ayan looked up. "Why are you so concerned?" Zain shrugged. "Because you're my project partner. That's all." Zain smiled. "For now." Ayan didn't know what that meant, so he returned to his notes. They left the university together. Outside, the evening air was cool. Zain walked beside him. "What's your dream?" Ayan looked surprised. "My dream?" "Yes. I want a good career." "That's a goal." "What's the difference?" A goal is something you achieve. A dream is something that makes you excited to wake up. Ayan thought about it. Nobody had ever asked him that question seriously. "I don't know," he admitted. Zain nodded. "That's okay. What about you?" "I want to travel." "Where?" "Everywhere." Ayan laughed. "That's not a place." "I know." Zain looked toward the road. "I want to see places where nobody knows me. No expectations. No assumptions. Just a chance to decide who I want to become." Ayan became quiet. There was something behind Zain's words. Something deeper than travel. But Ayan didn't ask. Their friendship grew naturally after that evening. The project became easier. Their conversations became longer. Soon, Zain started sending Ayan messages outside university. A photograph of a ridiculous-looking advertisement. A joke about their professor. A recommendation for a book. A simple question asking whether Ayan had eaten. Ayan always answered. Sometimes immediately. He didn't notice when that changed. At first, he replied because Zain was his friend. Then he started checking his phone because he wanted to hear from Zain. He still refused to think too deeply about it. One Friday, Zain didn't come to university. Ayan noticed immediately. He told himself it was because they had work to finish. But when Zain didn't answer his messages, Ayan became worried. By afternoon, he checked his phone several times. Finally, a message arrived. Zain, sorry I disappeared. Family issue. Everything is okay now. Ayan felt relieved. He replied, Ayan, glad you're okay. A minute later, Zain responded. Zain, did you miss me? Ayan stared at the message. He typed. No, deleted it. Then typed. Maybe. Deleted that too. Finally, he wrote, Ayan, the project was boring without you. Zain replied with a laughing emoji. Ayan smiled. Then he realized he was smiling at his phone. He quickly put it away. That evening, Hamza noticed. You look happy. I'm normal. You're smiling at your phone. So, who is it? Nobody. Hamza raised an eyebrow. Ayan refused to explain. The following week, the project was finally completed. Their professor praised their work, and Zain insisted they celebrate with tea at the small cafe near the university. Ayan agreed. They sat by the window. Zain looked unusually quiet. What? Ayan asked. Nothing. You're thinking about something. Zain smiled. I was just wondering how strange life is. Why? Because a few weeks ago, I didn't even know you. Ayan looked at him. Now you do. Yeah. Zain's smile became softer. And now you're one of the people I trust most. Ayan didn't know how to respond. He looked outside the window. For some reason, those words stayed with him. On the way home that evening, Ayan thought about how much had changed in such a short time. He had entered university believing that his life could be controlled through careful planning. Then Zain appeared. A person Ayan hadn't expected. A friendship he hadn't planned. Feelings he hadn't yet learned how to understand. That night, Ayan placed his phone beside his bed. A message arrived. Zain, good night, project partner. Ayan smiled. Ayan, good night. He put the phone down, then picked it up again. He read the message one more time. Ayan still didn't know what Zain would eventually mean to him. He only knew that the person he had barely noticed a few weeks earlier had somehow become the person he noticed most. And without realizing it, Ayan had taken the first step into a story he had never planned to live. The feelings I try to hide. After the university project ended, Ayan expected things to return to normal. Instead, his friendship with Zain became stronger. They no longer had an assignment forcing them to meet, yet they still found reasons to spend time together. Sometimes they studied in the library. Sometimes they sat at the small cafe near campus. On quieter evenings, they walked around the university grounds and talked about everything from their future careers to the most ridiculous things they had seen that day. Ayan had never been someone who easily trusted people. With Zain, however, it happened without effort. One afternoon, Ayan arrived at the cafe and found Zain already sitting near the window. You're late, Zain said. I'm 5 minutes late. 5 minutes is still late. Ayan sat across from him. You waited? Of course. Ayan smiled. Their conversations continued for nearly 2 hours. Zain talked about his plans for the future. He wanted to travel, build a career he actually enjoyed, and eventually live somewhere where he could make his own decisions. Ayan listened carefully. You always talk about freedom, Ayan said. Zain looked thoughtful. Because I think everyone deserves to decide who they want to become. Ayan lowered his eyes. That sounds difficult. It is. Then why do you keep trying? Because pretending to be someone else is difficult too. The word stayed with Ayan. He understood what Zain meant more than he wanted to admit. For years, Ayan had tried to be the son, student, and friend everyone expected him to be. He rarely asked himself what he actually wanted. Zain had somehow made him question that. And Ayan wasn't sure whether he liked the uncertainty. Over the next few weeks, their friendship became part of Ayan's daily routine. If something funny happened, Zain was the first person he wanted to tell. If Ayan had a difficult day, he looked for Zain. If Zain seemed upset, Ayan immediately noticed. The changes were small, but they were becoming impossible to ignore. One evening, Zain sent him a message. "Zain, are you free tomorrow?" "Ayan, why?" "Zain, I found a place you'll like." Ayan agreed. The next evening, Zain took him to a quiet rooftop overlooking the city. The place wasn't crowded. The evening sky was clear, and the lights below made the city look peaceful. Ayan looked around. "How did you find this place?" "I come here when I need to think." "About what?" "Everything." They sat several feet apart, talking about their lives. After a while, Zain became quiet. Ayan noticed. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." "You've been quiet for 5 minutes." Zain smiled. "You really notice everything, don't you?" "Only when something seems wrong." Zain looked toward the city. "My family has expectations for me. Sometimes I feel like I have to become the person they imagined." Ayan understood. "Maybe you don't." "Maybe." Zain looked at him. "What about you?" Ayan hesitated. "I think I have the same problem. You never talk about it." "I don't know how." "You can start with me." Ayan looked at him. There was no judgment in Zain's expression. So Ayan finally spoke. "I've spent so long trying to make everyone proud that I don't know what I'd choose if nobody had an opinion." Zain nodded. "Then maybe it's time to find out." That conversation changed something between them. Ayan began realizing that Zain wasn't just someone he enjoyed spending time with. Zain had become someone who made him feel understood, and that frightened him. A few days later, Ayan saw Zain talking to another student outside the library. They were laughing. Ayan felt an unfamiliar irritation. He immediately became annoyed with himself. Why did it matter? Zain was his friend. Friends could talk to other people. There was nothing wrong with that. Still, Ayan couldn't stop thinking about it. That evening, Zain messaged him. "Zain, you seem quiet today." "Ayan, just tired." "Zain, are you sure?" Ayan stared at the message. He wanted to explain. Instead, he replied, "Ayan, I'm Fina." It was the beginning of a distance neither of them understood. Over the next few days, Ayan became quieter. Zain noticed. "You've been avoiding me." "I'm not." "You are." Ayan looked away. "I'm just busy." Zain didn't argue. "Okay." That simple response made Ayan feel worse. He had expected Zain to question him. Instead, Zain respected the distance. And Ayan realized he didn't want that. He wanted Zain to stay. That realization frightened him more than anything else. That night, Ayan sat alone in his room, thinking about their friendship. He remembered the first day they met. The notebook. The project. The cafe conversations. The rooftop. The messages. He finally understood that something inside him had changed. He cared about Zain differently. Not simply because Zain was a good friend. Not simply because they spent so much time together. There was a deeper feeling that Ayan had been trying desperately not to name. He whispered to himself, "Why him?" There was no answer. Ayan had never planned to fall in love. He had never even imagined himself questioning his carefully organized future this way. Yet Zain had somehow become part of his thoughts, his routine, and his hopes. The following afternoon, Zain asked Ayan to meet at the cafe. When Ayan arrived, Zain was already there. "You've been distant," Zain said quietly. Ayan sat down. "I know." "Did I do something?" "No." "Then what happened?" Ayan looked at his hands. "I don't know how to explain it." "Try." Ayan took a breath. "I am confused." "About us." Ayan looked up. The question was gentle, not demanding. "I don't know what I feel anymore." Zain remained quiet. Ayan continued. "I know you're important to me. Maybe too important. Zane's expression softened. You don't have to decide everything today. But what if I lose you? You won't lose me because you're confused. Ayan looked at him. Zain continued. I'd rather you be honest than pretend you're okay. Ayan felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, he understood that he didn't need an immediate answer. He only needed to stop lying to himself. That evening, Ayan walked home alone. The streets were quiet, and the sky was turning dark. He thought about the person he had been before meeting Zain. He had believed that love was something people planned for, something that arrived at the right time, under the right circumstances, according to the right expectations. Now he understood that feelings didn't follow rules. They appeared unexpectedly. They grew quietly. And sometimes, they changed the way a person understood their own life. Ayan reached home and checked his phone. There was a message from Zain. Zain, take your time. I'm not going anywhere. Ayan read it twice. Then he smiled. He still didn't know what the future would bring, but he finally admitted the truth to himself. Zain wasn't just his closest friend anymore. He had become someone Ayan cared about in a way he had never expected. And that was the feeling Ayan could no longer hide. The choice between fear and truth. For several days after their conversation at the cafe, Ayan tried to understand what he truly wanted. He continued attending classes and completing his assignments, but his mind kept returning to Zain. He had finally admitted that his feelings were different from ordinary friendship. Yet admitting it privately was much easier than saying aloud. Ayan was afraid. He worried about his family's expectations, his future, and the possibility that people might judge him. More than anything, he feared losing Zain. If he said too much, their friendship might change forever. If he said nothing, he might lose Zain anyway. That uncertainty made him withdraw again. Zain noticed. One afternoon, Zain approached him outside the library. Can we talk? Ayan nodded. They walked toward a quiet corner of the university garden. Zain stopped. I need to ask you something. What? Do you actually want me in your life? The question caught Ayan off guard. Of course I do. Then why do you keep pushing me away? Ayan looked down. I don't know. Zain took a breath. I can give you space, Ayan, but I can't understand silence. Ayan knew he owed him an honest answer. I am scared. Of me? No. Then what? Ayan finally looked at him. Of what I feel. Zain became quiet. Ayan continued. I've always had a plan for my life. I knew what I was supposed to do, who I was supposed to become. Then you came along, and suddenly I started questioning everything. Zain listened carefully. I never meant to make things difficult, he said. You didn't. Then what did I do? Ayan smiled sadly. You made me care. Zain looked at him for several seconds. Maybe caring isn't something you should be afraid of. Ayan shook his head. It's not that simple. I know. Zain sat on a nearby bench. I'm scared too. Ayan sat beside him. You are, of course. Why? Because you're important to me. Those words were exactly what Ayan needed to hear. For the first time, he realized he wasn't alone in his uncertainty. They sat quietly for a while. Finally, Ayan said, I don't know what happens next. Zain smiled. Neither do I. What if we make mistakes? Then we learn. What if things become difficult? They probably will. Ayan laughed softly. You're not very reassuring. I'm trying to be honest. Ayan smiled. That honesty was what he trusted most about Zain. Neither of them promised that everything would be perfect. They simply agreed not to run away from what they felt. Over the next few weeks, their relationship slowly changed. Nothing happened suddenly. They continued meeting at the cafe, studying together, and supporting each other's plans. But there was a new understanding between them. Ayan felt less afraid. He started becoming more open about his thoughts. Zain encouraged him to pursue opportunities he had previously ignored. One morning, Ayan received an email about a career program in another city. It was exactly the kind of opportunity he had dreamed about. But instead of feeling excited, he immediately thought about Zain. He showed him the email. You should apply, Zain said. Ayan frowned. It's several hours away. So, I don't want to leave. Zain looked at him seriously. Don't make a decision about your future because you're afraid of losing me. Ayan was silent. I want you to succeed, Zain continued. If this is important to you, you should go. But what about us? We'll figure it out. Ayan looked at the application again. For years, he had believed love meant keeping someone close. Zain was teaching him something different. Real care could also mean encouraging someone to grow. Ayan applied. A few weeks later, he received the acceptance letter. He was excited. He was also terrified. The night before he was supposed to leave, Ayan and Zain returned to the bookstore where they had first met. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Ayan picked up a notebook from the same shelf. Remember this? Zain laughed. How could I forget? I still think you cheated. I won fairly. They sat at their usual table. Ayan looked at Zain. I never thought meeting you would change my life. Zain smiled. Neither did I. I used to think you were annoying. You still do. Sometimes. They laughed. Then Ayan became serious. I don't want distance to change what we have. It won't if we don't let it. Ayan nodded. I'll call. I'll answer. I'll message. I'll complain if you disappear. Ayan smiled. You always complain. Because someone has to keep you organized. Ayan looked down at the notebook. I've spent so much time trying to control everything. And now I'm learning that I can't. Zain nodded. The next morning, Ayan left for the new city. The first few weeks were difficult. His schedule was demanding, and the new environment felt unfamiliar. At first, he and Zain spoke every evening. Then their schedules became complicated. Sometimes Ayan was too tired to answer. Sometimes Zain was busy. Small misunderstandings began. One evening, Ayan missed several calls from Zain. When he finally returned the call, Zain sounded worried. You could have told me you were busy. I was exhausted. I know. I just wanted to know you were okay. Ayan became frustrated. I can't always be available. I know. Silence followed. Ayan realized Zain wasn't demanding constant attention. He simply wanted communication. I'm sorry, Ayan said. Zain sighed. Me too. The disagreement ended quietly, but it taught them something important. Feelings alone weren't enough. They needed patience. They needed trust. They needed to communicate. Months passed. Ayan began doing well in the program. His confidence grew. He started making plans for his career instead of simply following expectations. One evening, he received news that he had been selected for a major project. His first thought was Zain. He immediately called him. When Zain answered, Ayan could hear the smile in his voice. I knew you could do it. Ayan laughed. You were right. I usually am. Don't get used to hearing that. They talked for nearly an hour. After the call ended, Ayan sat quietly by the window. He realized something important. His feelings for Zain had not disappeared with distance. They had become stronger. But more importantly, they had become healthier. He no longer wanted to possess Zain's time. He wanted to share his life with him while allowing both of them to grow. Ayan finally understood what he had been afraid to admit. Zain hadn't destroyed his plans. He had helped him discover plans that were actually his own. Before sleeping, Ayan sent one final message. Ayan, you weren't supposed to become this important to me. Zain replied almost immediately. Zain, maybe the best people aren't the ones we plan for. Ayan smiled. For the first time, the future didn't seem frightening. It seemed open. And somewhere between fear and courage, Ayan had finally chosen honesty. The heart he stole without trying. 6 months had passed since Ayan had left for the career program in another city. At first, everything had felt unfamiliar. The streets were different, his schedule was exhausting, and he missed the quiet routines he had shared with Zain. But gradually, Ayan adapted. He became more confident at work and learned to make decisions without constantly worrying about whether everyone else would approve. Still, there was one person he continued thinking about every day. Zain. They stayed connected through messages and calls. Sometimes they talked for an hour. Sometimes they only exchanged a few words. But even on the busiest days, Ayan knew that Zain was there. One evening, Ayan received an unexpected message. Zain, are you coming home this weekend? Ayan smiled. Ayan, maybe. Zain, that's not an answer. Ayan, you'll find out. Zain sent a laughing emoji. Ayan had decided to surprise him. After months away, he wanted to see Zain's reaction when they finally met again. On Saturday afternoon, Ayan returned to his hometown. Instead of going home immediately, he walked toward the bookstore where their story had begun. The familiar sign above the door brought back memories. The notebook. The first conversation. The cafe. The rooftop. The uncertainty. Ayan smiled. He stepped inside. Zain wasn't there. Ayan walked toward the cafe section and sat near the window. 10 minutes later, the door opened. Zain walked in. He was looking at his phone and didn't notice Ayan immediately. Then he looked up. Both of them froze. For several seconds, neither spoke. Zain's face changed from surprise to happiness. You, Ayan laughed. Surprise. Zain walked toward him. I can't believe you're here. I told you I'd come back. You didn't tell me when. That was the point. Zain smiled. They sat together. For the first few minutes, they simply talked about ordinary things. Work. University. Family. Friends. But underneath the conversation was something neither needed to explain. They had missed each other. Ayan looked at Zain and realized that the months apart had changed his perspective. He had once feared that distance would weaken their connection. Instead, it had shown him how meaningful it was. After the cafe closed, they walked outside. The evening was calm. Zain looked at him. Are you happy? Ayan nodded. Yes. Really? Really? Zain smiled. I'm proud of you. Those words meant more to Ayan than he expected. I couldn't have done it without you. Of course you could. Maybe. They continued walking. Eventually, they reached the same rooftop where they had once talked about their fears. The city looked different from above. Ayan leaned against the wall. Do you remember what you told me here? Zain thought. Probably something wise. Ayan laughed. You told me that pretending to be someone else is difficult. Zain nodded. And you finally stopped pretending. Ayan looked at him. Yes. The silence between them was comfortable. Ayan took a breath. I've been thinking a lot. About what? About us. Zain became quiet. Ayan continued. When I first met you, I thought you were just a project partner. I was an excellent project partner. You were late twice. Details. Ayan laughed. Then his expression became serious. I never expected you to become this important to me. Zain looked at him. I didn't expect it either. I was so afraid of what other people might think. And now? Ayan looked toward the city. Now I think my life can't be built entirely around other people's expectations. Zain smiled. Ayan continued. I still care about my family. I still care about my career. But I also want to be honest about the person who makes me happy. Zain's expression softened. Are you sure? Ayan nodded. I'm sure about how I feel. I don't know everything about the future, but I know I don't want fear to decide it for me. Zain smiled. That's enough. They sat quietly for a while. Ayan thought about the person he had been before meeting Zain. He had believed love would make his life complicated. He had thought emotions were distractions. He had believed that careful planning could protect him from uncertainty. But Zain had changed that. Not by forcing him to change. Not by demanding anything. Simply by being there. By listening. By encouraging him. By showing him that love could exist alongside dreams. The following weeks were different. Ayan returned to the city for work, but this time he wasn't afraid of the distance. They had learned how to communicate. When something bothered them, they talked. When one of them had a difficult day, the other listened. When they disagreed, they didn't immediately assume the worst. Their relationship became less about dramatic moments and more about trust. Ayan eventually received an offer to return to his hometown for a long-term project. He considered it carefully. This time, he didn't make the decision because of fear. He considered his career, his family, and his own goals. Then he accepted. When he told Zain, Zain was thrilled. So you're coming back? Looks like it. Finally. Ayan laughed. You miss me that much? Don't become arrogant. Too late. Their reunion became another beginning. Months later, they returned to the bookstore. Ayan picked up a notebook from the same shelf. Zain looked at him. Again. Ayan smiled. This notebook started everything. Technically, I started everything. You stole the notebook. I returned it. After winning a completely unfair game. Zain laughed. They sat at the cafe by the window. Ayan looked around. The same place. The same memories. But they were different people now. He thought about how unexpected the entire journey had been. If someone had told him on the first day that this stranger would become one of the most important people in his life, he would have laughed. He had never planned to meet Zain. He had never expected to develop such deep feelings. He had never imagined that love could encourage him to become more honest and confident rather than less. Zain looked at him. What are you thinking? Ayan smiled. That you stole my heart without even trying. Zain laughed. I wasn't planning to. Neither was I. They sat together as evening light filled the bookstore. Ayan knew there would still be challenges ahead. Life wasn't suddenly perfect. Their families might not always understand everything. Their careers would continue changing. There would be difficult days. But Ayan no longer needed a perfect future. He had learned that love wasn't about guaranteeing that nothing would ever go wrong. It was about having someone with whom you could face uncertainty honestly. Zain had entered his life unexpectedly. He had challenged Ayan's carefully planned world. He had made him question old assumptions. And somehow, without demanding anything, he had helped Ayan understand himself. As they left the bookstore, Zain looked back. Ready? Ayan nodded. Ready. They walked into the evening together. Ayan didn't know exactly where their story would lead. For once, he wasn't afraid of that. Some stories are planned from the beginning. Others begin with a random meeting, a shared notebook, and a person you never expected to love. And sometimes, those unexpected stories become the ones you never want to end.